Sometimes the best thing to say about a controversial issue is nothing at all. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. I ended up taming the Presbyterian parrot, so I'll let you guys decide his name in the comments section. I will name him whatever the most liked name is. Please don't name him something ridiculous. And today, I'm going mining while I tell you guys about 5 issues that I have not decided on. 5 controversial issues in the church today, where I don't really know what I think about them yet, and I don't really have a settled opinion on any of these 5 issues. Because, you know, when you're like a Christian YouTuber or a Christian online influencer like me, a lot of people, I think, wrongfully use online influencers like me as sort of authority figures for where they get their doctrines from, and I don't think you guys should do that. I should not be a spiritual authority for any of you guys. All I should be, really, is a gateway drug for those of you who are not in, like, traditional churches to find your way into them. But I should not be seen as an authority, just a gateway drug to get into real churches and have real spiritual authorities like pastors and elders. So if you're a pastor, you really need to be able to give your thoughts on all of these issues for people that you are pastoring, for people that you are shepherding. But I'm not a pastor, so it's not my responsibility nor my authority to give advice on every single issue. I'm not a pastor, nor am I a universal life guru or anything. So because of that, there's some issues, important ones I might add, where I don't really know what I think. And I think that's okay, because I'm not qualified to give my advice on every issue, and whatever advice I do give is nothing more than a suggestion, unless I am directly quoting the Bible, in which case it's not my advice, it's God's advice, and I'm just being the messenger. So the first issue is on cessationism versus continuationism. I have never really known what I believe about this, and it's a very big issue. So for those of you who don't know, most people in the evangelical world have at least a general sense of what this issue is, but for those of you who don't, this has to do with, like, spiritual gifts, like speaking in tongues, things that a lot of Pentecostals do. We're talking like speaking in tongues, miraculous healings, things like that. So cessationists would think that there are certain gifts like these that the apostles had, but they've ceased. People no longer have these spiritual gifts. Whereas continuationists, obviously it's in the name, they believe these gifts have continued, and that people today still have these spiritual gifts. So speaking in tongues is like the most famous one, and I honestly have no idea what speaking in tongues even is, let alone if people still do it. I think there's really 4 opinions, and as far as I'm concerned, I could be convinced of any one of them. So it's like really 2 questions. What is speaking in tongues, and is it still active? So you have 2 questions. That means there's a sum total of 4 opinions on this. So some people think speaking in tongues is like an angelic language, so you'll often hear people speaking in tongues in, like, Pentecostal churches. It'll sound incomprehensible. It won't sound like any human language. So a lot of Pentecostals and people who do this will say is they're speaking some sort of angelic language. It's speaking in an angelic tongue. So, or it's maybe just like direct spiritual words that cannot be put into human language. Different things. But another opinion is that speaking in tongues, at least in the context of the Bible, is just people speaking what they think is normal English and it being understood in a different language. And that seems to at least somewhat have happened in the book of Acts, where the apostles were proclaiming the gospel, were preaching a sermon, and everyone heard it in his own language. So the apostles were probably preaching in either Greek or Aramaic, but travelers from all around the world were hearing them speaking in their own language, you know, like, I don't know, Latin or, I don't know, Kazakhstani. It probably wasn't a distinct language by then. You know what I mean? So that's another opinion on what speaking in tongues is. And the other question is it still active? There's some people who would say it is, and some people who would say it isn't. And I really don't know what I believe about this. I do not know what I believe about speaking in tongues. Now, there are some other issues that I think I do know what I believe on, and I do know enough to know that I'm neither a radical continuationist or cessationist. I'm definitely not charismatic. I don't think worship should be centered around spiritual gifts like speaking in tongues, so I'm definitely not charismatic, but that doesn't mean I'm not continuationist. I'm definitely not a strict cessationist either, because I know a lot of strict cessationists who believe that no miraculous spiritual things at all these days happen. Like, there are some Presbyterians who are really strict cessationists, so strict they don't think that demonic possession even happens anymore. And I definitely don't agree with that. So sometimes I'll tell people what I believe, and they're like, that's cessationism. And sometimes I tell people what I believe, and they're like, that's continuationism. Especially because some continuationists are like part of what's called, I think, the New Apostolic Reformation. And I don't want to sound like an elitist Yankee. Oh, for crying out loud, forget it. I am an elitist Yankee. Everyone knows that. New Apostolic Reformation churches, it's a very modern movement. How do I put this nicely? I can't put it nicely. It's a very blue-collar religious movement. You don't have, like, scholars or seminaries of the New Apostolic Reformation or the Word of Faith movement. It's very much not the most intellectual form of Christianity that has ever sprouted up. So I'm not even, it's not even worth making a video critiquing, but what I do know is that that's a radical form of continuationism, which believes there are modern day apostles, not just like disciples of Jesus, but apostles with with the same authority that the apostles had. So if anyone introduces himself like, hi, I'm Apostle Bob, automatically sus, don't listen to any, creeper. That creeper was probably sent by the New Apostolic Reformation. I don't know. But yeah, so... Or maybe that creeper was just mad about me being a Yankee elitist. Maybe that creeper is from rural Alabama. Anyway, so that's one thing I don't know what I believe about. So what I believe keeps me away from the radical extremes of continuationism and cessationism, because I don't believe that nothing supernatural happens at all today. I definitely don't believe that. I believe demonic possessions are real. I've heard very reliable accounts of them. I'm also not radical continuationist because I am skeptical about a lot of Pentecostal charismatic movements. I think a lot of what they experience might be real, but the amount of how disorganized it is, and the fact that most contemporary worship music, which I don't like, comes from Pentecostalism and charismatic stuff. So I'm somewhere in the middle. I think the debate really hinges on what you think about speaking in tongues, and I don't know what I think about speaking in tongues. So because of that, I'll have to be undecided on that issue for now. I know that Presbyterians are generally cessationist, but there's nothing in any of the confessions that absolutely demands you be that. And I did meet a group of Presbycostals while I was on a trip. I went to North Carolina to meet some conservative PCUSA leaders for the Reconquista. They're awesome people, but some of them are Presbycostals. Get this, they are conservative PCUSA, Presbyterian, charismatics. They exist. It's really weird. Also, some of them are in the EPC. The EPC is the Presbyterian denomination that makes the most room for charismatics. And one of the most involved Reconquista pastors identifies as a Presbycostal, because the Reconquista is not just a bunch of kids LARPing on the internet, even though it is partly that sometimes. There are pastors in these largely liberal mainline denominations that are working with me to help retake them. And one of the most involved pastors in the Reconquista is this Presbyterian minister who is Pentecostal. He's not Pentecostal as in the denomination, but he agrees with a lot of Pentecostal theology. Silverfish. How did the silverfish get here? I didn't know caves like... What? Okay, are these silverfish... who is sending these silverfish? Is it the Pentecostals again, or the charismatics? I don't know. Okay, well, why is everyone attacking me these days? Okay. I have to pile out of here somehow. This is a very weird type of cave. I've never been in one of these types of caves before. Okay, I'm gonna have to box myself in. This has been the worst mining trip ever. Okay, I hope I block myself off before the silverfish get in. Okay. Where was I? Oh yeah, religion. So the next thing that I'm not sure what I believe about is apostolic succession. So apostolic succession is this idea that in order to have a valid and legitimate church, your pastor needs to be ordained by a bishop who has apostolic succession. What does that mean? Apostolic succession means that that bishop was ordained by a bishop, who was ordained by a bishop, who was ordained by a bishop, going all the way back to the apostles. And you can make a lot of good arguments for and against apostolic succession. Now, I don't really see where apostolic succession is in the Bible. And I definitely don't agree with an episcopal apostolic succession. Apostolic succession is traditionally seen as traced through bishops. So to have a valid church, your pastor needs to be ordained by a bishop, who was ordained by a bishop, who was ordained by a bishop, going all the way back to the apostles. Ooh, diamonds. There's only one problem with that for us Presbyterians, and it's that we don't have bishops as a distinct office. Presbyterianism, like Presbyterian government, that's where we get the name from. It's the way we run our church government. Presbyterian government gets its name from the fact that we are run by presbyters, which means elder. We are run by elders rather than bishops, and our reasoning for that is that in the New Testament, the word elder is used interchangeably with the word bishop. So what we think happened in church history is that in the beginning, elder and bishop were just two words for the same office, and there wasn't this like hierarchy of bishops, but as the church evolved, this episcopal hierarchy, this hierarchy of bishops developed over time. So we believe that if there is apostolic succession, it would be traced through elders/presbyters. It wouldn't be necessarily traced through bishops, even though bishops are elders, in our opinion. So it would be traced through them as well. What is this? Oh, this is a nice, little, place. I've got a bad feeling about this, though. I think in one of the newer Minecraft updates, this is like a dangerous place. Oh, maybe that's why there's silverfish. I also feel like I should get out of here. I feel like I'm not in a good place here. I should probably leave. I feel like there's this monster like the warden that's like under my... Okay, this is like the worst Minecraft settlement ever. It's like, so I got chased out of my church by this pink sheep, but now there's like a warden or whatever other monster living under my area. Okay, I need to find a better cave to mine in. Anyway, apostolic succession. I keep getting interrupted. Maybe that's why I'm so indecisive about these issues. I get interrupted whenever I try to think about them. So, yeah, apostolic succession, this idea that you need to have your pastor be ordained by a pastor who was ordained by a pastor going all the way back to the apostles, or if you believe in episcopal apostolic succession, it needs to go through a line of bishops. The Presbyterian version of apostolic succession is presbyterial succession or ministerial succession, because it's not exactly the same type of apostolic succession as most groups who claim apostolic succession would have. Like, generally, the groups that talk about apostolic succession are Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Anglican and Oriental Orthodox. All of them have episcopal church government structures, meaning they're run by a hierarchy of bishops, but Presbyterians don't have that. So Presbyterians, I think, are actually kind of split over the issue of apostolic succession, because there's some Presbyterians who do believe in it, and those Presbyterians would trace their ordination through elders, meaning pastors and other ruling elders, not necessarily through bishops. Obviously, if you believe in episcopal apostolic succession, then you can't be Presbyterian, because we don't have bishops. We don't have bishops as a distinct office. I would say that all elders are bishops because they mean the same thing, but you know what I mean. We don't have bishops as a distinct office. So you can't be Presbyterian exactly if you believe in episcopal apostolic succession. But you could be Presbyterian and believe in ministerial apostolic succession, meaning succession through elders and presbyters. There's also a lot of Presbyterians who don't believe in apostolic succession, where they believe that any church that is properly preaching the word and properly administering the sacraments could be a true church, even if it can't be traced back to the apostles. I think there's pluses and minuses to both views. So the advantage of believing in apostolic succession is it gives some objective standard for measuring what counts as a true church. Because a common criticism of Protestants is that, according to Protestantism, anyone could just start their own church in their backyard. You could have Pastor Jim's Bible Church where you do communion with, ocean spray, communion with grape soda and cookies. I'm sure there are some non-denominational churches that might do something like that. So a common criticism of Protestantism is, anyone could just start a church. There's no rules, no restrictions. And if you don't have apostolic succession, if you don't have any regulation, any objective regulation on what counts as a true church, that criticism becomes a bit more valid because, technically anyone could. And yes, we already do have the regulations of the proper preaching of the word and the proper administration of the sacraments, which is what the Westminster Confession says. But I feel like that's a bit vague. And proper preaching of the word, proper administration of the sacraments, it's like, what does that mean? It means everyone thinks they're doing it properly. You'd never run into a church that says, oh, we don't do it properly here. So if you're saying that, that's not enough of an objective standard. I think the people drafting Westminster just wanted to distinguish themselves from both Roman Catholics and Anabaptists, which made sense for the time. But now we have a much wider variety of groups that we disagree with, so I think we should probably be more specific about exactly what counts as a true church. So in my head, the argument for affirming some type of ministerial apostolic succession is then we could objectively say that, your unordained, uneducated, Pastor Kyle's Bible church is not a real church because, even though it's like a community of believers that believe stuff together, your pastor doesn't have any valid ordination. And you could make an argument for that because you could say that for someone to be an elder, they need to be ordained by other elders. So you can't have just random people starting their own churches. And if you do have that standard, most traditional Protestant denominations would still have ministerial apostolic succession because most, traditional mainline Protestant denominations, even I think Baptists, can still sort of trace their ordination back to ministers who can trace their ordination back to the apostles. Definitely for Presbyterians. If you think ministerial presbyterial apostolic succession is valid, then Presbyterians definitely do have apostolic succession because all Presbyterian ministers can basically trace their ordination back to the Scottish Reformation with like John Knox and stuff. And those guys in the Scottish Reformation, they were all Catholic priests who not left the Catholic Church, but they participated in the Reformation, meaning that they went from being Catholic to being Reformed Catholic to being Presbyterian. Wow, this is an interesting cave. This mining trip, I've seen a lot of structures and other things in Minecraft I've never really seen before. This is interesting. But yeah. So Presbyterians can definitely claim ministerial apostolic succession if you believe that's a valid form of apostolic succession. I know most Catholics and Eastern Orthodox in my comments think it's not valid and we're just coping or whatever they say. But if it's valid, then it is. Here's the argument against it. I think you could make a bit of a biblical argument against it. Jesus said in Mark 9 to the disciples, when the disciples were telling Jesus to tell people to stop casting out demons in his name because they weren't with them, Jesus said, don't stop them because anyone who is not against us is for us. And that's often the passage I use to argue against people who talk about their one true church being the one true church, whether they're Catholic or Eastern Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox. I often use that passage. Jesus didn't really seem all that obsessed with people's, lineage in terms of ordination, because the people who had the best lineage in Jesus' day were the Pharisees. Jesus admitted that they sit in the seat of Moses, and he even told people to do what they say because of that, but that didn't make them infallible or anything. So I think apostolic succession solves a lot of problems practically because you can use that as a club against, random people who are just improvising in terms of the way they do church. But at the same time, it seems to go against the spirit of some of what the Bible says. So I guess also Karl Barth is a very influential Reformed theologian, even though he departs from Reformed theology in many significant ways. Karl Barth didn't believe in apostolic succession in a traditional sense. He said the apostolic succession we believe in is sort of a succession of the gospel, where it's like a succession of ideas, not a succession of individuals. And Barth's view on that does seem to be the majority view in the Reformed tradition, even though it's not universal. It seems that, most of the, 17th century Reformed scholastics did believe in ministerial apostolic succession. And it's like if you read Presbyterian scholastics from that time period, I think his name's Robert Bailey, he's one of them, one of the Presbyterian scholastics, one of the Scottish Westminster divines, they seem to argue like that. Whereas if you read modern Presbyterians, like on the Orthodox Presbyterian Church website or Ligonier Ministries, they're going to argue against any traditional form of apostolic succession. So that seems to be an issue that Presbyterians are divided on. So it's an issue that I'm also unsure about. Now, if you think that was controversial, now the next issue I'm going to talk about is public schools. And that's an issue that I've been thinking about a lot because I'm about to get married, I'm going to have kids pretty soon, and I'm going to need to make a decision to what to do about them. I am legitimately very conflicted on public schools because the debate over this has some of my personal interests conflicted. So, On the one hand, I did go to public school. My fiance also went to public school, and we both survived. There's a lot of, alarmist rhetoric from a lot of conservative Christian parents saying, like, don't send your kids to public school. The teacher's going to teach them evolution, and they're going to be atheists. It's like, no, Mr. Billy Bob, the reason the kids are atheists is not because they're taught science, is that you taught them religion's incompatible with science. No. Generally, I think the biggest threat to kids in public schools isn't whatever the teachers are going to teach them. It's simply the influence of the other kids. I went through public school, and yes, we were taught, pseudo-history in history class, and a lot of the teachers were liberal, but the biggest threat, the biggest way in which I was alienated for being Christian was simply the influence of the other kids. That's mainly the biggest problem. And the generation of the students is almost always going to be more progressive than the generation of the teachers, because that's what progressive means. It always gets worse over time. So that's the bigger problem with public school. But at the same time, I survived public school. And yes, it was hard, but I'm glad that I got exposed to all the degeneracy and chaos of the secular world early on, so it never came as a shock to me later in life, because I've heard of so many stories of parents trying to shelter their kids and, like, homeschool their kids, and the children abandon the faith the second they get the slightest bit of exposure to the secular world when they go off to college or whatever. You can't shelter kids forever. Maybe you can when they're young, and maybe you can for a little while, but it's sort of like the way you have to give kids immunity to germs, let them play in the mud a bit, so they can develop a healthy immunity to viruses and bacteria, so that it's like if you keep the environment too sanitary for kids when they're young, they're going to have a terrible immune system when they grow up. I think you need to do that for exposure to the secular world as well. If you shelter kids too much, they're just not going to be able to resist challenges to their faith when they're older. So it's like, yeah, it's hard to survive 13 years of public schools as a Christian, but if you do, you'll emerge from there being like a Christian Navy SEAL, like a Navy SEAL for the faith. The problem is, you don't want to make bets with your kids. You don't want to gamble your kids to the public school system. But it's not really the system that's the problem. It's just the culture of the other kids. So another reason why I'm inclined to not be against public schools is I really just don't like the mindset of conservative retreatism. Something I keep saying, the dead horse I keep beating on this channel, is the reason conservative Christians lose every cultural battle and every religious battle, honestly, is because their instinct is always to retreat. If a city gets hijacked by liberals, leave it, move to the countryside. If a university gets hijacked by liberals, become anti-intellectual hillbillies and just move to a farm and tell your kids not to go to college and then be surprised when they're not the elites running culture in 30 years. If your mainline church gets hijacked by liberals, just leave it and go to some evangelical church and run in a strip mall somewhere. Conservatives always have this retreatist mindset, and it's why they always lose their influence. It's why progressives always end up changing the culture. It's because progressives like to get involved in the world, and conservatives just like to leave when things don't go their way. And I feel like there's a cycle, not just with public schools, but for everything in the culture. It's like Christians retreat from the culture because the culture's getting more progressive, because Christians retreat from the culture because the culture's getting more progressive, because Christians retreat from the culture because, you know what I mean. And I think this can apply to public schools. But at the same time, it's not kids' job to be little missionaries for the parents. It's not the kids' job to try and convert the whole school. So yes, you could say that Christian parents need to be involved in local school boards to have a good influence, but at the same time, you don't want to gamble with your kids, especially if there's really a negative influence in public schools. And there often is a negative influence in public schools, and here's where I'm going to give the other side of my argument. Because I became a Christian when I was exposed to homeschooled Christian kids for the first time. They had like a life in their eyes that I had never seen in my public school classmates. It was something completely alien to the way I was raised, the universe in which I was raised. And I became Christian seeing how like kind and patient and loving these homeschooled Christian kids were. But the thing is, those Christian kids who converted me, those homeschooled Christian kids who converted me, they ended up leaving the faith once they got exposure to the secular world, once they went off to like college and stuff. So it's a tricky issue. And another reason is that I support Christian schools in theory, but not in practice, and here's what I mean. Because in theory, I believe it's the church's job to transform society in every way, and there should be Christian institutions, and Christians founded the best universities. Like, Bible-believing Protestants founded the Ivy League schools before they were hijacked by leftists who hate the Protestant values those schools were built upon. Protestants used to do all those things, and now Protestants are a joke. I mean, I still believe in reviving Protestantism, which can't really happen without a retake of the mainline Protestant churches. Man, I can't find my way out of this cave. But, yeah, so in theory, Christians should be starting schools, and they should be the best schools. But in practice, most, Protestant or, evangelical Christian schools are academically a joke. And I know there's exceptions. And I know that even in schools that objectively don't have the best academics, you still could have a good time there. But I know there's exceptions. I know that there's some, classical education schools that are not like this. But generally, when I think of, a private evangelical Christian school, which fundamentalists' parents send their kids to shelter them from the world, what I think of is this, super uneducated, lowest common denominator fundamentalist Christianity where, science class is taught by the gym teacher. And, they just watch, God's Not Dead, volume 47, and science class is nothing but saying, the Bible says the world was made in 7 literal days, and then they'll play a Ken Ham video or something. I'm sure it's not all like that, but generally I've heard that evangelical private Christian schools are atheist factories. I know many anecdotes of kids being raised in those schools that had very poor academics, and they all turned out like weed-smoking atheists. So I generally don't like them in practice, but in theory they're good because the church is supposed to transform every area of society. And like I said, Christians do need to be founding the best universities. And really, the Christian worldview shapes every aspect of life, so we shouldn't just compartmentalize faith into just what we hear on Sunday mornings and then not apply it to our learning. Because it used to be said that theology is the queen of the sciences. So people need to start thinking like that again. So I support Christian schools if they can be done well, but generally in America they're not. The only exception is Catholic schools. Catholic schools are generally pretty good. They're generally like public schools, but with a little bit less secularism and wokeness. So they seem to be equal academic quality to public schools. So yeah, all that is to say, I'm kind of undecided on the issue of public schools. I think homeschooling might be a good option for a lot of people. There's really 2 types of homeschooled kids. One type is where the parents are scientists and doctors, and they want their kids to have a much better education than they'd have in public schools, so the kids are doing calculus in 2nd grade. That's one type of homeschool kid. The other type of homeschool kid is someone who their parents are just weird fundamentalists who want to shelter them, so they're in high school and they think the dinosaurs were fake or whatever. Actually, I know a lot of adults on Twitter who think dinosaurs were fake because fundamentalism. And honestly, there are more flat earthers in the modern world due to the internet giving a voice to idiots than there were ever flat earthers back in the day. The only dogmatic flat earthers that have ever existed have been in, the 21st century. It just shows you how silly modernity can be sometimes. Alright, 2 more issues. These are going to be quick. Apparently, it's a big thing to talk about head coverings these days. A lot of people are talking about the Bible verses that say women should wear head coverings in church. Some people say that was just a cultural thing. Some people say that a woman's hair counts as her head covering. And, there's a growing number of people who take it, at face value and say, yeah, women should all be wearing head coverings in church. But even the most conservative denominations, like the Orthodox Presbyterian Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, or even a lot of conservative Baptist churches, don't enforce this. It's very, very rarely enforced in any churches. So, I don't know. I haven't really looked into the debates about this issue because I just don't care, honestly. I don't care. There's so many bigger things that the church needs to worry about. There's so many greater sins that are happening in a lot of churches today, so many greater, wrong practices, that this is something we can address when everything else is perfect. So I'm not saying I support head coverings. I'm not saying I'm against them. I'm not going to waste any of my energy on this debate because I don't really know. Now, here's something that might be a bit more important, and that's grape juice versus actual wine in communion. I'm undecided on that as well. I'm not undecided on whether we should use grape juice or wine. I'm undecided on whether it needs to be wine or whether grape juice is acceptable. Because, on the one hand, Jesus did consecrate wine, and there's no biblical precedent for being opposed to alcohol as a whole. But I do have some personal bias here, because while I understand there isn't biblical precedent for just being opposed to alcohol in general, I am personally a teetotaler, and I never drink alcohol, and, I go to Presbyterian churches that mostly use grape juice. My only exception for wine is when I go to a church that uses wine. And I'm sort of conflicted about the temperance movement. I'm not sure what I think about that, so I guess you could add that to the list of things I'm undecided on. So, but the reason I'm a teetotaler at the same time is not for religious reasons. I made the decision to never drink alcohol way before I was even religious. I just don't want to. Part of it is because I can't stand the feeling of not being fully in control or whatever. So I am undecided on that, and I also think that practically unfermented wine, grape juice, might be beneficial, at least as an option, because there's some people who are recovering alcoholics. And if they're recovering alcoholics, then even the tiniest taste of alcohol will cause them to relapse, and having an alcohol-free option for people like that might be beneficial. But of course, if the Eucharist can only work one way, then that doesn't matter. We have to just, work with that. Anyway, but also, I've heard of, places in rural Africa where churches use, rice and water for a communion. So I do have a very high view of the Eucharist, but at the same time, I have a lower view of the necessity of doing things exactly right. I think we should do them exactly right, but I don't think it doesn't work if you don't do it exactly right, because I don't think any church ever does it exactly right. So those are 5 issues that I'm undecided on. So if you want to, you could leave issues that you're undecided on in the comments, and then we could all talk about that. But as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all later.